The space station called Concord Reach floated in the middle of nowhere, held in place between three star systems that had been fighting each other for 200 years. It was not a beautiful place. It smelled like recycled air and old metal. The hallways were too narrow, and the lights were always a little too bright. But it was a neutral place, and that was all that mattered when 24 alien civilizations needed to sit in the same room without killing each other. The delegations arrived one by one over 3 days. The Valorian Empire came first, because they always came first. Their ships were long and silver and moved through space like they owned it, which, in their opinion, they did. The Kreths had 4 warships just to carry their one ambassador. The Yan Collective arrived in a cloud of smaller vessels that moved together like a flock of birds, each one linked to the others by thin beams of light. Earth sent 3 people and a small cargo shuttle. The cargo shuttle was not impressive. It had a dent on the left side near the engine and a faded Earth flag painted near the door. The 3 people who stepped off it did not look like a delegation from a species that had recently joined the galactic community. They looked like people who had just taken a very long flight and wanted to find somewhere to sit down. The first 2 were junior diplomats named Cho and Vasquez. They were young and eager and spent the first hour walking around with wide eyes, staring at the alien delegates with barely hidden amazement. The third person was different. His name was Cale Dorn. He was not particularly tall. He was not particularly broad. He had dark hair cut short, a face that showed nothing in particular, and eyes that moved slowly and carefully around every room he entered, like he was quietly memorizing it. He wore a plain dark jacket, with no rank markings and no decorations. He carried nothing except a small bag over one shoulder. He looked, to most of the alien delegates, like absolutely nobody. That impression lasted until people started paying closer attention. The station had assigned a small welcome banquet on the first evening. It was the kind of event where everyone stood around holding drinks they did not want, making conversation they did not care about, trying to figure out who was worth talking to. Cale stood near the window with a cup of something warm and looked out at the stars. Princess Serene Velorha noticed him because he was the only person in the room who had not looked at her. This was unusual. Serene was used to being noticed. She was the heir to the Valorian throne, the daughter of Emperor Velorha III, and by the standards of her people, she was considered remarkably striking. Tall, with the pale silver-white skin of the Valorian high bloodline, and eyes that were a deep, shifting violet. When she entered a room, people looked. Lesser species stared. Ambassadors straightened their spines and became very formal very quickly. The quiet human by the window had glanced at her once when she came in, noted her the same way he had noted the door and the other exits, and then returned his attention to the stars. Serene decided this was either an insult or something interesting. She crossed the room to find out which. She introduced herself with her full title, which took some time. He said Cale Dorn and extended his hand, which was a human greeting she had read about but never received. She took it carefully. His grip was firm and brief, and he let go exactly when she started to pull back, as if he had been watching for that signal. "You are part of the Earth delegation," she said. It was not a question. "Yes." He turned back to the window. "The view from here is good. You can see the edge of the Keth Nebula from this angle, the blue part on the left." She looked. He was right. It was quite beautiful. They stood in silence for a moment. On Valoria, silence between strangers was uncomfortable. It meant someone was failing at their social duty. But the silence with this human was somehow not uncomfortable. It was simply quiet. "What is your position in the delegation?" she asked. "General purpose," he said. She waited for him to say more. He did not. Later that evening, the first trouble started. It was minor, as these things went. A Kreth honor guard had positioned itself too close to the Yan seating area, which was a violation of spacing protocols, which to the Yan was essentially a declaration of aggression. Voices rose. 3 different translation systems tried to operate simultaneously and made everything worse. An aide ran to find senior diplomats. Two Kreth warriors put hands on their weapons. The room went very tense, very fast. Then Kale Dorn walked over and stood between the two groups. He did not raise his voice. He did not gesture dramatically. He simply stood there, in the space between them, and said a few quiet words to each side in turn. He spoke to the Kreth in their own language. He spoke to the Yan in theirs. His voice stayed the same, low, even, completely calm, like a man discussing the weather. The Kreth warriors took their hands away from their weapons. The Yan cluster closed up slightly, a sign of reduced alarm. The whole thing was over in under 2 minutes. Serain watched from across the room. The other Valorian delegates were watching too. Beside her, her chief aide, a sharp woman named Tova, leaned close and spoke quietly. Did he just defuse a Kreth honor standoff? Yes, Serain said. Speaking Kreth battle dialect. Yes, without being asked. Yes. Serain kept watching Kale as he moved back to his spot by the window, picked up his cup and looked at the stars again. Tova, get me everything the station's records have on this man. Tova came back 20 minutes later, looking slightly confused. There is almost nothing, she said. A name, a delegation assignment, some basic identification details, and one note at the bottom of his file that I cannot get the translation system to interpret correctly. What does it say? Tova looked at her datapad. It says, "Do not engage without authorization." Serain looked across the room at the quiet human by the window. He was watching the nebula again. He looked like a man with nothing on his mind at all. She found herself wondering what was actually going on behind those still, careful eyes. The summit was scheduled to run for 10 days. On the morning of the second day, a message arrived for the Valorian delegation from Emperor Velorha, Serain's father, marked with the imperial seal and the highest level of private encryption. It proposed a political marriage alliance between Valoria and Earth. It listed, as Earth's chosen representative, one Kale Dorn. It offered no explanation at all. Valoria Prime was the kind of world that made visitors feel small on purpose. The capital city was built from white crystal stone that had been cut and shaped over 4,000 years into towers so tall they disappeared into the high clouds. The streets were wide and clean and lined with statues of emperors and war heroes, stretching back to an age when Valoria had been conquering systems that humanity had not yet discovered. Everything about the planet was designed to remind visitors that they were standing in the center of something very old and very powerful. Kale Dorn arrived on a Tuesday. He came in the same small cargo shuttle, which landed on the Grand Imperial platform beside 3 enormous Valorian state vessels. The platform workers stared. His junior aide, a young man named Ren, who had been assigned to the mission at the last minute and had not stopped looking nervous since, whispered something about whether they should have dressed better. Kale picked up his bag and walked down the ramp. The first formal meeting was scheduled for the palace's Great Hall, a room large enough to hold 500 people that currently held about 30, all of them arranged in careful positions to communicate Valorian social rank through geography. Serain sat at the center, flanked by her court advisors and her personal guard. She wore formal court dress, deep blue and silver, the Valorian imperial colors, and her expression was one that she had practiced for situations she expected to be difficult. Kale walked in, looked around at the room once, and sat down in the chair that had been placed for him on the opposite side of the Great Hall's long table. He set his bag down beside him. He took a book out of the bag and set it on the table. Then he folded his hands and waited. The book had a cracked spine and a hand-drawn bookmark sticking out of the top. Serain looked at the book. She looked at the man who had brought it. Then she looked at her chief advisor, who had nothing useful to offer. "You are Kale Dorn," she said formally, which was how all official first addresses were done on Valoria. "Yes," he said, "you are Princess Serain Valorha. Your house has held the Valorian throne for 11 generations. The first of your line, Empress Velaria, unified the Valorian home system after the 3-century division. The dynasty's longest reigning emperor was your great-great-grandfather, who held the throne for 62 years. He paused. I read about it on the way here. Interesting history. The court advisor next to Serain leaned close and murmured that this information was correct. Serain had not expected that. The formal session covered the political terms of the proposed alliance. Kale had clearly read every document that had been sent to the Earth delegation, and he asked questions that were specific and thoughtful. Not the broad, obvious questions of someone learning the basics, but the narrow questions of someone who had already understood the basics and wanted to know more. He spoke in standard Galactic, without any of the small errors that usually marked human speakers. Twice, he said a short phrase in the old formal Valorian dialect, not the common speech, but the court language used only in official ceremonies, and used it correctly both times. After the session, walking through the palace corridor, Serain asked Tova quietly how he had learned Court Valorian. We don't know, Tova said. His file has almost nothing in it. I know what his file has. I read it 3 times. Serain watched him walking ahead of them, talking to her cultural liaison in easy, relaxed tones. Get me more. The next morning, a young palace servant dropped a tray of ceramic cups outside the guest quarters. They shattered loudly, and the servant, who was new, looked horrified and started trying to collect the pieces with shaking hands. Kale came out of his room, looked at the situation, sat down on the floor and helped collect the pieces without saying a word about it. He talked to the servant, something quiet, easy, and the servant laughed. Serain saw it from the end of the corridor and said nothing. On the 3rd day, Serain's court-martial, Lord Veth, a man who had served 4 wars and still walked like he was looking for a 5th, presented her with what he called a necessary formality. A delegation marriage, he explained, required that the human prove his worthiness to stand beside a Valorian princess. This was done through the Kelvar, a formal honor challenge, conducted through a chosen proxy warrior. Serain agreed. She told herself it was tradition. It was also, she admitted privately, curiosity. Kale was informed. He listened, asked a single clarifying question about the rules, and politely declined. Lord Veth informed him this was not optional. Kale politely declined again. Lord Veth chose a proxy warrior anyway, a guard named Orveth, who was 7 feet tall and had won the Imperial Fighting Championship 4 years running. The match was to first yield. It would be non-lethal. It was announced in the court as a formality. Before it began, Orveth, demonstrating his superiority, before yielding was even required, struck Ren, Kale's young aide, with his practice weapon while warming up. It was an accident, or was meant to look like one. Ren hit the floor hard. The room went quiet. Kale looked at Ren on the floor. He looked at Orveth. Then he picked up the practice weapon that had been set out for him, walked to the center of the room, and said, very quietly, that he was ready. The match lasted 40 seconds. Orveth did not yield. Orveth was simply no longer able to continue. He was not seriously hurt. Kale had been precise about that. But he was on the floor, and he was staying there, and his expression was one of complete and genuine confusion about how he had arrived at this position. Kale set the practice weapon down on the mat, walked over to Ren, and helped him up. He checked the young man's arm, decided it was bruised but not broken, and handed him a water bottle. The court was completely silent. Serain realized she had stopped breathing somewhere around the 20-second mark, and had only just noticed. Lord Veth, who had presided over many such contests, looked at the floor where his champion was still lying, and then looked at Kale Dorn, who was now asking Ren about his arm, in a conversational tone, and said nothing at all for a long moment. Then he said, stiffly, that the human had passed the Kelvar. Kale said, "Thank you. Is dinner still at 7th hour?" That evening, Serain sat in her private study with Tova, and looked at the intelligence report that had come back from their request on Kale Dorn. It was 4 pages long. 3.5 of those pages were black lines, redacted, blocked out, removed. What remained were fragments: a name, a code designation, A series of dates without locations. And at the very bottom of the last page, in small print that looked like it had been added as an afterthought, a note from whatever agency had processed the request. It said, "This inquiry has been logged. Please direct further questions to the Earth Strategic Council directly." Tova looked at the paper. "That is not a reassurance," she said. "No," Serene agreed. She closed the file. She sat for a long time thinking about the 40-second match, and the palace servant, and the cracked spine book on the table. Serene was not a woman who stopped when something blocked her way. She was Valorian, and Valorian nobility had been breaking through walls, literal and otherwise, for 4,000 years. A redacted intelligence file was not a wall. It was an invitation to try harder. She started over. Rather than going through official channels which had already shown her their limits, she went sideways. She sent private messages to old contacts, intelligence officers from 3 different systems who owed her family favors, a retired Kreth information broker who had worked the Galactic Core for 30 years, and 2 Yan historians who had made a career of piecing together things that were not meant to be pieced together. She told them all the same thing. She needed to know who Kale Dorn was, whatever they could find. What came back over the next 2 weeks came in pieces, like fragments of a broken mirror. No single piece was enough, but when she laid them all out on the table and stood back and looked at them together, the shape that emerged was extraordinary. The first piece came from the Kreth broker. The Kreth Dominion had, 8 years ago, implemented a total blockade of the Sol system. This was not widely known. The Kreth had never officially announced it, and Earth had never officially complained about it, which had been strange at the time. The blockade had lasted 11 days. It had ended with no military engagement, no fleet movement, no formal negotiation that any record showed. It had simply stopped. 3 Kreth commanders from that operation had retired almost immediately afterward. One of them, in a private memoir that had never been published, had written a single paragraph about those 11 days. The broker had found a copy. The paragraph said only, "A human came aboard our command vessel, alone. No weapons we could find, no threat we could name. He sat across the table from Admiral Vethke and spoke for 2 hours. When he left, the Admiral gave the order to end the blockade. I asked the Admiral afterward what the human had said. The Admiral told me it was not what he had said. It was what he had known." The second piece came from one of the Yan historians, who had spent years cataloging the aftermath of the Marrow Station crisis. The Veil Syndicate had taken 12,000 civilians hostage on a deep space station near the outer border systems. Standard protocol would have been military response, a siege, a breach, acceptable losses. Instead, the multi-system authority had sent in a single negotiator. One person, alone, into a station held by 400 armed syndicate fighters. The crisis had ended in 11 hours. The syndicate leadership had been found secured and unarmed. The hostages had been released without a single casualty. The negotiator had walked out the main entrance, given a brief verbal report, and requested that someone bring him something to eat because he had not had lunch. The historian's notes said the negotiator's name had been removed from every official record. But a survivor, a civilian who had been held near the station's operations center, had remembered a face. She had described it in her testimony. The description matched. The third piece came from the retired intelligence officer, a Zellerai woman named Osha, who had spent 20 years tracking galactic conflicts from the outside. She had a file on something called the Ashen Corridor event. 4 years ago, 2 major fleets had been positioned for direct engagement near a border system. 200,000 military personnel, weapons hot, communication lines jammed. The engagement would have started a war that would have pulled in at least 6 systems. It had not started. Osha's notes documented what her surveillance network had caught. A single small vessel crossing the space between the 2 fleets. It had no markings. It had gone directly to the larger of the 2 flagships. It had been aboard for 1 hour and 40 minutes. When it left, the fleet had stood down. The fleet commander had told his officers, according to intercepted communications, that he had received information that changed his assessment of the situation. He had offered nothing more specific than that. All three pieces had the same shape. One human, going somewhere he should not have been able to go, doing something that should not have been able to work, and then leaving quietly and not talking about it. Seraine sat with all of this in front of her for a long time. Then she went and found Kale. He was in the palace's eastern garden, which was a place she had not expected him to know about. It was not on any guest map. It was a small, quiet space between two wings of the palace, where her mother had planted a particular type of low blue flower 30 years ago that still came back every season. She had not been there in months. He was sitting on the low stone bench near the center, reading his book. She sat down on the other end of the bench. She had thought about how to begin this conversation for 2 days. She had prepared a careful structure, lay out the evidence, observe the reaction, proceed from there. Instead she said, "I know about Marrow Station." Kale turned a page. "And the Ashen Corridor," she said. "And the Kreth Blockade, and several other things that I do not think have names that are in any public record." She paused. "The files are almost completely redacted, but I found the edges." He closed the book with his finger holding his place and looked at her. His expression was the same as always, calm, attentive, giving nothing away. But she had been watching him for weeks now, and she had started to learn the very small differences. He was not surprised. He had expected this, or something like it. "You're thorough," he said. "You should see the sources I used to get there," she said. Something shifted in his face, just for a moment, very small, that she thought might have been the beginning of a smile. "You should see the files they didn't redact," he said. She looked at him. "What does that mean?" "It means there is more," he said simply. "What you found, the blockade, the station, the corridor, those are the ones that had witnesses. There are others that did not." The garden was very quiet. The blue flowers moved slightly in a low wind. "Why does no one know?" she asked. "If you did these things, if a human did these things, why has your civilization not culled everyone? Why do you not have fleets of warships and 1,000 medals and an entire political apparatus built around what you have done?" Kale thought about this for a moment. "Because the point of those things was not to be known," he said. "The Kreth blockade ended. The hostages came home. The two fleets went back to their bases. Those were the goals. Everything else is decoration." "Decoration," she repeated. "Yes." He opened his book again. "Also," he added, "my government would prefer that certain parties not know the specifics. Knowing what one person can do tends to motivate people to prevent one person from doing it again." Seraine looked at him sitting there in the small garden, with his cracked spine book and his completely unconcerned expression, and felt the clear and distinct sensation that she had been significantly wrong about something for quite a long time. She did not know yet exactly what she had been wrong about, but she was starting to understand the shape of it. "I want to know," she said. "All of it, what you will tell me." He considered this. "That might take a while," he said. "I am not going anywhere," she said. He nodded, as if this was a reasonable arrangement, and turned another page. "Then we should probably start at the beginning," he said. He looked at her with those still, careful eyes. "Do you want some tea while we talk? I found a good place in the lower city that imports something almost identical to a Darjeeling second flush. It is very good." She had no idea what a Darjeeling second flush was. The wedding was held on Valoria Prime, in the great ceremonial courtyard of the Imperial Palace, under a sky that was the particular deep blue-gold color of a Valorian late afternoon. It was attended by representatives from 41 civilizations. The courtyard had held ceremonies for 4,000 years, coronations, treaties, the rare and significant alliances that shaped galactic history. The stones underfoot were worn smooth by generations of feet. Kale had asked, 2 days before, if he needed to wear something specific. Seraine had described the traditional Valorian formal dress, which involved several layers, a ceremonial sash in the colors of the allied family, and a headpiece made from hammered silver that had been part of Valorian wedding traditions for 300 years. He had listened carefully, and then said, "So a dark suit with the right color sash?" And she had looked at him for a long moment, and then said, "Yes, that will be acceptable." He wore a dark suit. The sash was the exact right shade of blue. The ceremony itself was halfway through when the attack began. It was not random. It was not opportunistic. Someone had planned this for a long time and had chosen this moment deliberately. When Valoria's palace defenses were in formal ceremony configuration, when 41 delegations were gathered in one place, when the galaxy was watching. The Sovereign Horde, a coalition of 6 species who had been building quietly in the outer systems for years, hit the palace's orbital defense platform first, then the communication towers, then sent 3 dropships through the gap before the automatic systems could respond. The courtyard alarms went off. The ceremony stopped. Delegates ran or froze, depending on their nature. Valorian guards formed a defensive perimeter around the Imperial family, with practiced speed. The outer courtyard gates sealed. Kale, standing at the ceremonial platform, heard the alarms, looked up at the sky, watched the first dropship descend through the cloud cover, and was quiet for about 3 seconds. Then he turned to General Orvoth, the old Valorian war general who had been standing near the back of the ceremony in his full dress uniform, who had watched the 40-second match weeks ago and had not looked at Kale the same way since, and said very quickly, "The south gate is the only point of entry they can use. The perimeter wall height eliminates the east and west. They want captives, not a massacre, or they would have used larger weapons. They will try to split the defense and create confusion before their fighters are fully on the ground. Do you have communications to your inner garrison?" Orvoth stared at him for half a second. Then he said, "Yes." "Then here is what we need to do." What followed was not a battle in the way that battles were usually told afterward, the dramatic charges, the turning points, the heroic moments sharp enough to remember. It was more like watching someone solve a problem that everyone else had thought was unsolvable, using means that were hard to follow and harder to explain. Kale moved through the chaos of the courtyard and spoke to people as he went. 6 words to a Valorian guard captain that reorganized the entire defensive line in under a minute. 3 words to a panicking Kreth delegate that stopped the Kreth bodyguards from opening fire on a group of running Yon representatives they had mistaken for attackers, which would have been a disaster. He took something from his jacket pocket, a small flat device no larger than his palm, pressed something on it, and the Horde fighters' communication signal went silent, cutting their coordination off at the source. He had been carrying a signal jammer to his own wedding. Serene, who had been placed by her guards near the inner palace wall, watched him from across the courtyard. She had lived her whole life around warriors. Her people had been at war more often than not across their history. She knew what a trained fighter looked like, knew the difference between courage and skill, knew what it meant to be good at something terrible. What she saw in Kale was different from all of that. He was not performing bravery. He was not in the grip of battle fury. He was completely, almost unnervingly calm. The same calm he had in the garden, the same calm he had reading his book, the same calm he had when he asked about dinner. He moved like someone who had done this so many times that it had become ordinary to him, like a problem he had already solved before and was simply solving again. The Horde fighters who made it into the courtyard met a defense that should not have been organized that quickly, and was organized anyway. 12 were captured in the first 4 minutes. The rest pulled back toward the south gate. Then Kale walked toward them. He walked alone, without a weapon, toward 20 armed Horde fighters in the gateway. And the Valorian guards who moved to follow them, he stopped with a single raised hand, without looking back. He reached the fighters. He spoke to their field commander. Nobody else could hear what was said. The conversation lasted less than 4 minutes. The Horde fighters withdrew. Not defeated, not destroyed, They turned around and walked back to their dropships and left. The courtyard was quiet. Somewhere, a piece of decorative crystal that had been knocked loose in the fighting fell and broke on the stones. General Orvath was standing 3 feet from Serene when it ended. He had been a soldier for 60 years. He had fought in 7 full-scale wars, 4 border conflicts, and more engagements than he had ever bothered to count. He had seen things done in battle that he still dreamed about, though he did not say this to anyone. He watched Cale Dorn turn and walk back across the courtyard, straightening the sash of his wedding suit. And Orvath stood very still. "General," his aide said quietly beside him, "are you all right?" "Yes," Orvath said. "I have fought for 60 years. I have trained under 5 great masters of Valorian war doctrine. I have studied every significant military engagement in the last 200 years of galactic history." He paused. "I do not know what that was, but I know it was not what we do. Whatever humans make, it is not warriors. It is something else. I do not have a name for it." His aide asked what he meant. "I mean," Orvath said slowly, "that we train people to fight. We make them stronger, faster, harder. We teach them to win." He finally looked away from Cale. "He did not fight to win. He fought to end it. Those are not the same thing. They are not even close to the same thing." He picked up his formal helmet from the ground where it had fallen. "I would very much like to know where they teach that." Serene found Cale after. He had found a bench at the edge of the courtyard, outside the perimeter of the first response medical team that was checking delegates for injuries. He was sitting with his forearms on his knees, looking at the ground, and for the first time since she had known him, he looked tired. Not hurt, just tired, in the way that people got tired from a thing that had cost them something internal that did not show on the outside. She sat beside him. She did not say anything. After a moment, he looked up at the sky. The attack ships were gone. The Valorian air defense had them tracked. The immediate crisis was over. "That was your wedding suit," she said finally. He looked down at the sash, which had a small tear at the end. "Yes." "Are you all right?" He thought about this with the seriousness he gave to all questions that deserved it. "Yes," he said. "I will be." She looked at the tear in the sash, and then at his face, and said, "We did not finish the ceremony." "No," he agreed. "If you still want to." He looked at her. Something in his face was different from the beginning of this. Not from today, but from the beginning, from the station, from the first conversation. Something had opened up that had not been there before, or had been there but kept very carefully behind those still eyes. "Yes," he said. "I would like that." 3 months after the wedding, the galaxy was still talking. Not about the wedding itself, though that had been discussed enough. What the galaxy was talking about was the attack that had been stopped, and more specifically, the man who had stopped it. The story had spread the way stories spread when they are both true and almost unbelievable. In pieces, from different sources, each piece confirming the others and making the whole thing harder to dismiss. An official from the Kreth delegation had talked. A Yan historian had published. 2 Valorian palace guards had given recorded testimonies. By the end of the first month, the version being discussed in war rooms and throne rooms and intelligence offices across 30 systems was remarkably close to what had actually happened. The effect was interesting to watch. Ambassadors who had previously scheduled meetings with the Valorian Earth Alliance in 6 months quietly rescheduled them for as soon as possible. A border dispute between Earth's nearest neighbor system and a third party, which had been ongoing for 2 years with no resolution, was abruptly settled by the third party making significant concessions. 3 separate intelligence agencies from 3 separate civilizations began, as far as Sarine's information network could tell, urgent internal reviews of their assessments of human capabilities. None of this was loud. None of it was announced. But it was real, and it was fast, and it was the kind of change that took decades to produce through conventional diplomacy. Cale watched all of this from a distance, and said very little about it. He had settled into the palace with the same quiet ease he seemed to bring to everything. He had a study now, which he had arranged to his own satisfaction over the course of about 2 weeks. Books on 3 walls, a desk by the window, a small electric kettle that he had brought from Earth, and which was the only piece of technology in the room that had not come with the palace. He met with advisors and ambassadors when asked. He read reports. He asked questions in meetings that tended to shift the entire direction of the conversation, without anyone quite being able to explain how. He had also, slowly, learned to make Valorian morning tea, which was a complicated process involving 3 separate steeping stages and a very specific water temperature. He did it wrong the first 4 times, and right the 5th. And after that, he made it every morning without thinking about it. Serene found she had started to structure her mornings around that. On a bright afternoon in early spring, she asked him the question that had been sitting with her for months. They were in the Eastern Garden. It had become their place, without either of them deciding that, in the way that some things become true without being arranged. The blue flowers were coming up again. He was reading. She put down her own papers and looked at him. "Why didn't you tell me," she said, "when we first met, about any of it?" He looked up. "Everyone I met at the summit asked me what my title was," he said, "what my position was, what I had done, what Earth's strategic interests were, what my government's position on 7 different ongoing disputes was." He paused. "You asked me what I thought about the Keth Nebula." Serene was quiet. "You asked what I thought about the history of your dynasty," he said. "You asked why I was reading that specific book. You asked if I had ever been somewhere cold enough to be actually unpleasant, because you had read that Earth had such places and you could not understand why anyone would stay." He looked at the garden. "No one had asked me things like that before, not in a very long time." He was quiet for a moment. "The other things, the files, the operations, the rest of it, those were things I did. The questions you asked were about who I was. Those are not the same." She thought about this for a while. "What are you?" she asked then, "if you had to say one thing?" He considered it seriously, the way he considered everything. "Depends on the day," he said. "Depends on what is needed. Today, I am someone who is going to lose an argument about whether honey goes in the tea before or after steeping. Because I know I am right about this, but I also know you are not going to agree with me. And I have decided this is not a battle worth having." She said, "Honey goes in after. The heat changes the compounds if you add it during steeping." "I know that," he said. "That is why I put it in during steeping. The changed compounds taste better." He turned a page. "This is, as I said, not a battle I am going to win." She found herself smiling. This happened more often now than it used to. In the outer systems, the Sovereign Horde was quiet. Their field commander, the one Kale had spoken to for 4 minutes in the gateway, had not spoken publicly about what had been said. He had, however, submitted a formal withdrawal of all Horde territorial claims in 3 disputed systems the week after the wedding. No explanation given. The other Horde leadership had not contested this. In the capital of the Kreth Dominion, an analyst named Sev was preparing a classified briefing for the Kreth High Command on the subject of human strategic capacity. She had been working on it for 2 months. It was, she would tell her supervisor, the most difficult document she had ever been asked to write, because she was not sure the concepts it needed to contain existed yet in Kreth military doctrine. The core problem, as she had written in the opening paragraph, was this: human strength could not be measured the way other species' strength was measured, because it did not operate the same way. Other civilizations built power through accumulation, more ships, more weapons, more territory, more fighters. Humans seemed to build something different. She had not yet found the right word for it. In the palace of Emperor Velorha, a young aide named Pel, 20 years old, ambitious, recently assigned to the outer diplomatic staff, had been given the task of preparing a short briefing on the new Human-Valorian alliance. He did his research carefully, and at the end of it, he went to the Emperor's senior advisor, an ancient woman named Korith, who had been in service to the imperial family for longer than Pel had been alive. and he asked the question that the briefing had not been able to answer. "How do they make someone like him?" Pell asked. "The human, Kale Dorn. What is their process? What do they train? How do you build a civilization that produces that?" Korath looked at him for a long moment. She had served through 4 emperors. She had watched the galaxy shift in ways that most people did not notice until they were already living in the aftermath. She had, in fact, been the one to recommend to the Emperor that the political marriage to Earth was worth considering after a particular piece of intelligence from Concord Reach that had crossed her desk. "I asked that," she said, "through diplomatic channels, 3 months ago, when the reports from the wedding came in." She moved to the window. "I received a reply from Earth's Council last week." Hell waited. "They said," Korath continued, and I am quoting their exact words because I have read this reply 7 times and I am still not entirely sure how to process it. They said, "He is not that special. You should meet his mother." Hell stared. "Yes," Korath said. "That was my reaction as well." In the Eastern Garden, the afternoon light was going gold and long. Kale had set his book down and was watching the light move across the crystal wall of the palace. Serene was reading through a trade proposal from the Yan that she had been putting off for a week. She reached the end of it and put it down. Somewhere in the palace, a bell marked the end of the working day. A bird, one of the small blue-feathered ones that nested in the high spires and came down to the garden sometimes, landed on the stone wall near them, and sat there, deciding whether they were interesting. He was watching the bird with the same quiet attention he gave to everything. "Tell me about your mother," she said. He turned to look at her. There was a warmth in his face that she had come to know, not the still, careful expression of the diplomat and the professional, but the other one, the one that was just him, the one she had been slowly learning to read over these months, like a language that had no textbook. "You will not believe me," he said. "Try," she said. The bird on the wall tilted its head. The evening light came across the blue flowers. Kale began to talk. "And in war rooms and throne rooms and intelligence offices across 30 systems, the galaxy continued to discuss what it thought it knew about the quiet human who had married a Valorian princess. They traded theories and fragments and redacted files. They built pictures from incomplete information and called them understanding. None of them came close. But that was all right. He had never needed them to.